There are places on this earth that continue to puzzle archaeologists, no matter how many times they're studied. Ancient cities built without ordinary streets, temples carved directly into mountains, fortresses protected by enormous walls, and settlements where people lived in ways that have almost disappeared from history. Some were abandoned for centuries. Others were buried beneath the earth, hidden by forests, deserts, and time. Ancient carvings whose meanings are forgotten, sacred places that still raise questions, and monuments that reveal just how advanced and organized these early communities could be. The more we uncover, the stranger our past becomes. Every excavation reveals another forgotten world. Every artifact tells another story, and every discovery reminds us that history is far from complete. Tonight, we're traveling across the world to explore ancient ruins and forgotten places that continue to reveal secrets about the people who built them. Quick question before we start. Do you know how people fell asleep before melatonin existed? I wrote a whole book on it. 22 ancient rituals, $9.99 right now. Links below. Now, let's begin our journey. The island tomb covered in carvings no one can read. On a small island off the coast of Brittany, a prehistoric tomb sits beneath a low stone mound. From the outside, it looks ancient. But inside, the walls are covered with hundreds of mysterious carvings. Curved lines, geometric shapes, axes, and strange patterns that have no known written meaning. This is the Gavrinese cairn, one of the most remarkable Neolithic monuments in France. Gavrinese lies in the Gulf of Morbihan, a region famous for its prehistoric monuments. The tomb was built around 3500 BC, more than 5,000 years ago. At that time, Neolithic communities were building enormous stone monuments across Western Europe. They farmed, raised animals, worked stone, and created elaborate burial places for their communities. Gavrinese was one of these monuments. The cairn is made from layers of stone, covering a long passage and central burial chamber. The entrance leads into a narrow corridor, built from massive stone slabs. Walking deeper inside, the walls become increasingly decorated. Nearly every surface is covered with carvings. For a prehistoric monument, the amount of decoration is extraordinary. The carvings are not simple scratches. They were deliberately created across the stone surfaces. Some form repeating geometric patterns. Others resemble axes, hooks, curves, and abstract shapes. A few designs may represent objects or weapons, but many remain impossible to identify with certainty. There is no surviving text explaining them. The people who carved them left only the images. One of the most famous stones inside Gavrinese, known as the Gavrinese slab, contains an especially complex design. Its surface is filled with patterns that appear to overlap. Some researchers believe the carving may represent an axe or another object. Others see abstract symbols. The interpretation remains uncertain. The strange thing is that some of these designs are not unique to Gavrinese. Similar motifs appear on other megalithic monuments in the region. This suggests that the people who built these monuments shared artistic traditions. Ideas were being passed between communities, possibly across considerable distances. The carvings may therefore have been part of a wider symbolic system, but we no longer know how that system worked. The stones themselves are impressive. The builders had to select enormous slabs, transport them, position them, and create a stable passage beneath the cairn. Some stones weigh several tons. Without modern machinery, this required organized labor. The construction tells us that these communities were capable of working together on a large scale. The tomb was probably connected with burial and ritual activity. Chambered monuments like Gavrine's were not ordinary houses. They were places connected with the dead, ancestors, and ceremonies. People may have returned to the monument over generations. The carvings may have been part of those traditions, but exactly what happened inside remains unknown. The location is also interesting. Gavrine's is an island today, surrounded by the waters of the Gulf of Morbihan. When the monument was built, the landscape was already changing. Sea levels were different, and the relationship between the islands and mainland was not exactly the same as today. The monument was therefore part of a much larger prehistoric coastal landscape. For thousands of years, the cairn remained hidden beneath its mound. The people who built it disappeared. Their descendants changed. Their traditions changed, and the original meaning of the carvings was eventually forgotten. The stones remained, but nobody could explain what the symbols meant. When the monument was rediscovered and investigated, archaeologists realized how extraordinary the interior was. The carvings were still remarkably well preserved. The protected environment inside the cairn had shielded the stone surfaces from much of the weathering that affected exposed monuments. The result was a rare survival of prehistoric artwork. The carvings raise an important question. Were they writing? There is no evidence that they formed a written language. They may have represented objects, religious ideas, people, animals, or abstract concepts. Some designs are recognizable enough to suggest deliberate imagery, but others remain completely mysterious. Perhaps the most fascinating possibility is that the people who created these carvings understood exactly what they meant. To them, a particular shape may have carried a message that everyone in the community understood. A symbol could have represented a person, a place, an ancestor, or a belief. But without that cultural knowledge, modern researchers can only study the shapes themselves. The tomb also shows how much effort prehistoric people put into remembering the dead. They could have buried their ancestors in simple graves. Instead, they built a large stone monument, moved massive slabs, created a long passage, and decorated the interior with hundreds of carvings. The monument was designed to last, and it did. Eventually, the tomb stopped being used. The entrance became sealed, and the cairn became part of the landscape. Grass and soil covered much of the structure. The island continued changing around it, while the carvings remained hidden inside. For thousands of years, the symbols waited in darkness. Today, Gavrini's is one of the most important prehistoric monuments in Brittany. Its carved stones provide evidence of a sophisticated Neolithic culture, but they also preserve one of archaeology's most frustrating mysteries. We can see the symbols, but we cannot read them. We can recognize patterns, but we do not know their original meaning. The island tomb covered in carvings no one can read reminds us that some of the oldest messages left by humans may not be messages we can understand. More than 5,000 years ago, people entered this stone chamber, carved their symbols into the walls, and left them behind. Whatever those carvings meant, their creators believed they were worth preserving. Today, the people are gone. Their language is forgotten. But the stones remain, still covered with the mysterious marks of a world that disappeared thousands of years ago. The oldest stone house still standing after 6,000 years. On a small island in northern Scotland, 2 stone houses have survived for more than 5,000 years. They are low, simple, and partly built into the ground. But what makes them remarkable is that they still stand today. This is the Knap of Howard, one of the oldest preserved stone houses in northern Europe. The Knap of Howard is located on the island of Papa Westray in the Orkney Islands. The houses were built around 3,700 BC during the Neolithic period. At this time, people in Orkney were already living in settled farming communities. They grew crops, kept animals, made pottery, and built permanent homes from stone. The 2 houses at Knap of Howard stand close together. They were built from local stone, with thick walls designed to withstand the harsh island climate. The entrances are low, and the interiors contain several built-in features. Stone benches run along parts of the walls, while other areas were used for storage and daily activities. The buildings were not temporary shelters. They were real homes. The houses were connected by a short passage, allowing people to move between them. One building appears to have been larger, while the other may have served a different household purpose. Exactly how the 2 spaces were organized is uncertain, but their close relationship suggests that the people living here were connected. Perhaps they belonged to the same family or shared activities within the settlement. The thick walls are one reason the houses survived. They were constructed using stone, a material that could withstand the weather far better than wood or plant-based structures. The roofs themselves have disappeared, but the lower walls remain. Looking at them today, it is easy to imagine the basic shape of the original homes. A small entrance, a central living space, and stone features built directly into the walls. Inside, archaeologists found hearths, stone furniture, pottery, and other traces of everyday life. The hearth would have been central to the household. It provided heat, light, and a place for cooking. The stone benches may have been used for sitting, sleeping, or storing objects. These simple features make the houses surprisingly easy to understand. The people who lived here were farmers, but the sea was also important. Orkney's islands provided access to fish, shellfish, seabirds, and other marine resources. The community could combine farming with what the surrounding waters provided. This flexibility was important in a northern island environment. The people had to adapt to strong winds, cold winters, and changing seasons. The houses also show how carefully these communities built for their environment. The walls were thick, the entrances were protected, and much of the structure was partly below ground level. This would have helped shelter the interior from the cold and wind. The design was practical, but it also created a surprisingly comfortable living space. The archaeological evidence suggests that the houses were occupied for generations. People repaired and reused parts of the buildings, leaving objects behind as daily life continued. Eventually, the settlement was abandoned. The reasons are not completely clear. Changing environmental conditions, new settlement patterns, or shifts in the local community may have played a role. For thousands of years, the buildings remained buried beneath the soil. The surrounding landscape changed, but the stone walls survived. Because the houses were partly protected by the earth, much of their lower structure remained intact. When archaeologists excavated the site, they found an unusually clear example of a Neolithic home. The discovery was important because prehistoric houses rarely survive this well. Many Neolithic homes were built from timber, mud, thatch, or other materials that disappear over time. Stone is different. Even when the roof is gone, the walls can remain. At Nap of Howard, that preservation allows us to see where people lived, rather than only where they were buried. This makes the site particularly valuable. Monumental tombs tell us about death. Ceremonial sites reveal aspects of belief. But a house can tell us about ordinary life, where people sat, where they cooked, where they stored things, and how they organized their living space. The Nap of Howard gives us a rare glimpse into the everyday world of Neolithic Orkney. The surrounding islands contain many other prehistoric monuments. Orkney is famous for its chambered tombs, stone circles, and ancient settlements. Sites such as Skara Brae show another extraordinary example of Neolithic architecture. Together, these monuments reveal that Orkney was home to communities capable of building surprisingly complex settlements. Nap of Howard is one of the earliest pieces of that story. There is something particularly interesting about the houses themselves. They are not enormous. They were not built to impress distant visitors. They were simply homes. The people who constructed them needed somewhere warm and protected to live. They built with the materials available around them and created structures that could survive the harsh environment. Their practical decisions are still visible thousands of years later. We do not know the names of the families who lived here. We do not know what they called their houses or what language they spoke. There are no written records from this period, but the architecture preserves some of their daily choices. A hearth was placed here. A bench was built there. An entrance was positioned to protect the interior. These small details bring us surprisingly close to prehistoric life. Eventually, the people left. The houses became silent. Soil accumulated around the walls, and vegetation slowly covered the remains. The settlement disappeared into the landscape, but unlike a wooden village, the stone walls did not vanish. They remained beneath the earth, waiting to be uncovered. Today, the Nap of Howard houses still stand on Papa Westray, facing the harsh northern landscape. The sea surrounds the island. The wind moves across the fields, and the stone walls remain where they were built more than 5,000 years ago. The roofs are gone. The people are gone. But the basic shape of their homes survives. The giant stone warriors standing on top of the pyramid. Tula was the capital of the Toltec civilization, a powerful society that flourished in central Mexico roughly 1,000 years ago. The city reached its height between the 9th and 12th centuries. Its ruins include plazas, temples, pyramids, ball courts, and monumental sculptures. But nothing at Tula is quite as striking as the 4 giant warriors. The statues stand on the upper platform of Pyramid B. Each one was carved from several large pieces of stone, then assembled into a single monumental figure. The warriors are shown wearing elaborate clothing, decorated headdresses, chest ornaments, and what appear to be weapons or ceremonial objects. Their size makes them immediately imposing. They seem to stand watch over the ancient city below. The figures are commonly called Atlantes, a name inspired by the idea of human figures supporting architecture. But the statues were not necessarily intended to represent ordinary warriors. Their exact identity remains uncertain. They may have represented Toltec warriors, important religious figures, or supernatural beings. The objects they carry provide clues, but not a complete explanation. One of the most recognizable features is the headdress. The figures appear to wear elaborate headgear, possibly connected with military or religious symbolism. Their clothing is equally detailed. Carved bands, chest ornaments, and other decorations cover their bodies. These details show how carefully the Toltec artists represented status and identity. The weapons are also important. The figures appear to carry equipment associated with warfare, including atlatls or spear-throwing equipment. If these objects were intended as military symbols, they may have communicated the power of the Toltec state. But the statues could also have had a religious purpose. In the ancient world, warriors, rulers, and religious figures were often closely connected. The pyramid beneath them was an important ceremonial structure. Visitors approaching the monument would have seen the enormous figures high above the plaza. Their position would have made them visible from a considerable distance. The architecture therefore created a dramatic relationship between the people below and the giant figures above. The warriors were not hidden inside a chamber. They were meant to dominate the landscape. Tula itself was a major urban center. Its plazas could accommodate large gatherings, while temples and ceremonial buildings surrounded them. The city also contained impressive stone carvings, including columns, animal sculptures, and reliefs. The Atlantes belonged to this larger artistic tradition. They were part of a city designed to display power. The Toltecs became famous in later Mesoamerican traditions. Centuries after Tula declined, stories about the Toltecs continued to influence other cultures. Later Aztec traditions remembered the Toltecs as legendary builders and skilled artists. Because of this, the historical Toltecs and the later legends surrounding them can sometimes become difficult to separate. The archaeology of Tula provides the more reliable evidence. The city eventually declined, and its political importance disappeared. Buildings were abandoned, stone sculptures were damaged or moved, and vegetation gradually covered parts of the ruins. The Atlantes survived, but their original surroundings changed. For centuries, the giant figures remained part of a ruined city whose history was only partly understood. Modern archaeology eventually revealed the importance of Tula. Researchers excavated the ceremonial center, studied the architecture, and reconstructed parts of Pyramid B. The enormous warriors became the defining images of the site. Today, they stand above the pyramid once again. But their original position may not have been exactly the same as what visitors see now. Some reconstruction was necessary after archaeological excavation. That makes the statues even more interesting. What we see today is based on archaeological evidence, but the ancient monument itself changed over time. Pieces were found, studied, and reassembled. The figures had already survived centuries of abandonment before becoming archaeological monuments in the modern world. The purpose of the warriors remains one of Tula's biggest questions. Were they guards, representations of warriors, images of rulers, or figures connected with a religious tradition? Their equipment suggests warfare, but their monumental position suggests something more symbolic. They may have represented the military power of the city, while also serving a ceremonial function. Their connection with the Toltec state is particularly important. Tula was not simply a settlement. It was a political center, and monumental architecture could communicate authority. Large statues, massive pyramids, and decorated plazas would have made the power of the ruling society visible. The Atlantes may therefore have been part of that political message. The stone itself also tells a story. The figures were carved from volcanic rock, a difficult material to shape at such a large scale. The craftsmen had to remove large quantities of stone, create recognizable human forms, and carefully carve the details. The finished statues were heavy, and moving them into position would have required organized labor. There is also something strangely human about the warriors. Despite their enormous size, their bodies are carefully proportioned. Their faces are calm, almost expressionless. They do not appear to be attacking anyone. Instead, they simply stand. Their stillness makes them seem more like permanent guardians than active soldiers. For the people who built Tula, these figures must have been extraordinary. Imagine approaching the pyramid, looking upward, and seeing 4 gigantic human forms towering above the plaza. Their weapons, headdresses, and carved ornaments would have been clearly visible. The experience would have been very different from seeing the weathered statues today. The original sculptures may also have been more visually impressive than they appear now. Ancient Mesoamerican monuments were often painted, although most of the color has disappeared from exposed stone. If the Atlantes were once brightly decorated, their appearance would have been dramatically different. Instead of gray stone, visitors may have seen powerful figures covered in color. The truncated pyramids align to the equinox. High in the Andes of Ecuador, a group of strange, flat-topped pyramids rises from the mountains. They are not like the pointed pyramids of Egypt. Their tops were deliberately cut flat, and long ramps climb their sides. This is Cochaski, an ancient ceremonial complex built more than 500 years ago by the Karankwi and Kayambi-Karankwi peoples. Cochaski sits about 3,100 meters above sea level, on the southern slopes of the Mojanda Massif, not far from Quito. The landscape is dramatic. Mountains surround the site, and the valleys stretch far into the distance. From the tops of the pyramids, the builders had an enormous view of the surrounding region. The complex contains 15 truncated pyramids, along with several funerary mounds known as tolas. They were constructed from a local volcanic earth material called kangawa. The official archaeological park dates their construction broadly between about 1250 and 1530 AD. These were not simple hills. They were carefully shaped monuments. Many of the pyramids have long ramps. The ramps lead toward their flat upper surfaces, where structures once stood. Those buildings were mostly made from materials that did not survive. So today, the pyramids can look surprisingly empty. But originally, their summits would have been active spaces. People could climb them, gather there, and take part in ceremonies. The astronomical connection is one of the most interesting aspects of Cochaski. Research and local archaeological interpretation have linked parts of the complex with observations of the sun, including the solstices and equinoxes. One project specifically documented the relationship between the pyramids and solar events, while other research has examined possible astronomical alignments across the wider landscape. But the exact purpose of every alignment remains uncertain. At the equinox, the sun rises almost directly in the east and sets almost directly in the west. For people living in the Andes, tracking the movement of the sun could have been important. It could help organize agricultural seasons, ceremonies, and the yearly calendar. The surrounding landscape provided natural reference points, while the pyramids created fixed positions from which the sky could be observed. Some interpretations connect Cochaski with an ancient solar calendar. One nearby circular structure has been studied for possible relationships with solar and lunar cycles. The evidence is fascinating, but archaeologists remain careful. A measured alignment does not automatically tell us exactly what the builders intended. The architecture gives us clues, not a written explanation. That uncertainty makes the site more interesting. The people who built Cochaski left no surviving written instructions describing their astronomy. We cannot ask them why a particular pyramid was placed where it was. We can only examine the geometry, the landscape, the horizon, and the relationship between the structures and the movement of the sun. The pyramids may also have been connected with burial. Several large mounds at Cochaski are identified as funerary tolas. This means the complex was not simply an astronomical observation point. It was part of a much larger ceremonial landscape, where the living, the dead, and the natural world may have been connected through ritual. The builders also understood their environment. The pyramids were constructed from materials available locally, and the site was positioned high above the surrounding valleys. From the summit, a person could see distant mountains and other important landmarks. This enormous visibility may have been important for ceremonies. It could also have helped connect different parts of the landscape. The people who lived in this region were organized into complex chiefdoms. They farmed, produced pottery, worked stone, and maintained settlements across the northern Ecuadorian highlands. Cochaski represents the ability of these communities to organize large construction projects. Moving and shaping huge quantities of earth required many workers, planning, and leadership. The pyramids also reveal something about ancient Andean architecture. Instead of building enormous structures entirely from stone, the builders used compacted earth. This produced broad, stable platforms. The flat tops could support buildings, while the sloping sides created the distinctive pyramid shape. The result was impressive, even without the massive stone blocks seen at other ancient sites. Over time, the world around Cochasqui changed. The Inca expanded into northern Ecuador, and later the Spanish arrived. The political systems that had created the pyramids disappeared. The ceremonial center was eventually abandoned, leaving the enormous earthworks exposed to the mountain environment. Grass slowly covered the surfaces, and the original buildings disappeared. For centuries, the pyramids became part of the landscape. People could still see the mounds, but much of their original purpose was forgotten. Archaeological investigation eventually revealed that these were not natural hills. They were deliberately constructed monuments, part of a sophisticated pre-Inca cultural landscape. The 28,000-year-old rock art painted on a stone ceiling. The shelter lies in northern Australia, in the rugged rock country of the Northern Territory. It is not an ordinary cave. The ceiling is formed by massive slabs of sandstone, supported by natural stone pillars. From below, the roof looks almost like the ceiling of an ancient hall, and across that ceiling, people left traces of their presence. The paintings include animals, human figures, geometric forms, and other images whose meanings are not always clear. Some were painted in red and yellow ochre. Others were created using different pigments. Over time, new images were added over older ones. The result is a layered record of Aboriginal artistic activity. The site became especially important because archaeological excavations revealed evidence of very early occupation. Charcoal from the shelter has been dated to around 28,000 years ago, providing evidence for human activity at the site during the Ice Age. That does not mean every painting on the ceiling is 28,000 years old. Dating individual rock paintings is extremely difficult. But the archaeological deposits show that people were using this place deep in Australia's ancient past. This distinction matters. Rock art can survive for enormous periods. But proving exactly when a particular image was painted is much harder. Pigments often contain no material suitable for straightforward radiocarbon dating. Researchers therefore use other evidence, including archaeological layers, pigment analysis, and relationships between paintings and deposits. Australian rock art is notoriously difficult to date directly. At Nwarla Gabern Mang, the archaeology gives us something especially valuable. It shows that people repeatedly returned to the shelter. They did not simply pass through once, paint a picture, and disappear. The site was used again and again. Different generations left traces of their activities, creating a long archaeological sequence. The shelter itself would have been an attractive place to live. It provided shade from the intense Australian sun, protection from rain, and a relatively stable environment. The natural stone pillars divided the space into different areas. People could gather beneath the enormous ceiling, work, prepare food, make tools, and create art. Excavations have uncovered stone tools and other archaeological materials. These objects help researchers understand what people were doing inside the shelter. The site was not simply an art gallery. It was a living place. People used the space for everyday activities, while also leaving images on its surfaces. That combination makes the site particularly valuable. The ceiling paintings are fascinating because of their position. Many ancient rock paintings are placed on vertical walls. Here, some of the artwork is spread across the overhead stone surface. Anyone sitting beneath it would have looked upward, seeing images covering the ceiling above. The rock shelter itself became part of the artwork. Some paintings appear to overlap. An older image may sit beneath a later one, showing that the surface was reused. This creates a kind of archaeological timeline. One generation painted something. Later generations added their own images, and eventually the ceiling became a layered record of activity. Among the animals represented in Arnhem Land rock art are kangaroos, fish, and other creatures important to the environment. Some images can be recognized clearly, while others are more difficult to interpret. The artists were observing the world around them, but we cannot always know what each image meant. An animal could have been part of everyday life, or it could have carried a much deeper cultural significance. This is one area where archaeology has limits. Modern researchers can describe the pigments, the shapes, the locations, and the archaeological layers. But the original cultural meanings belong to the people who created them. Without written records, we should be careful about assigning modern explanations. A symbol that looks simple to us may have carried an entire story for the people who painted it. The surrounding landscape is just as important. Arnhem Land contains rugged escarpments, rock shelters, water sources, and extensive areas of natural habitat. For Aboriginal communities, these places were not simply empty wilderness. They were landscapes filled with knowledge, memory, and cultural connections. Nwarla Gabernmang was part of that larger world. The age of the archaeological evidence is particularly remarkable. Around 28,000 years ago, the world was in the middle of the last ice age. Sea levels were lower. The climate was different, and people across many regions were adapting to changing environments. Yet in northern Australia, people were continuing to use shelters like this one. They were making tools, living in communities, and creating visual traditions. The site also challenges the idea that ancient people lived only in simple temporary camps. Nwarla Gabernmang contains a substantial rock shelter with evidence of repeated occupation. The space was repeatedly used, modified, and incorporated into cultural practices. It was clearly important enough for people to return. Over thousands of years, the landscape around the shelter changed. Climate shifted, vegetation changed, and generations came and went. But the stone ceiling remained, the pigments remained in places, and the archaeological deposits accumulated below. Each layer preserved another fragment of the site's history. When archaeologists began investigating Nwarla Gabernmang, they discovered that the shelter contained far more than isolated paintings. It was a complex archaeological site. The relationship between the paintings, the stone tools, the sediments, and the structure of the shelter helped reveal how people used the place. The discovery also emphasized the importance of working with Aboriginal communities. These are not simply archaeological objects disconnected from living cultures. The site exists within Aboriginal country, and its interpretation must take cultural knowledge and custodianship seriously. The archaeological record and indigenous knowledge can provide different kinds of information, each helping us understand the significance of the landscape. The paintings themselves remain silent. We can see the artist's choices, but not hear their voices. We can identify some animals, but not always understand why they were painted. We can establish that people used the shelter thousands of years ago, but individual stories have not survived in written form, and perhaps that is what makes the ceiling so powerful. It is not one painting. It is a record built over generations, one image beside another, one layer over another, until the stone itself became a canvas carrying traces of an ancient community. The stilt houses of Hamudu. More than 7,000 years ago, people living in eastern China built their homes above the ground. Wooden posts supported raised floors, while the wet landscape stretched around them. This was the Hamudu culture, one of the earliest farming societies known from the lower Yangtze region. The Hamudu site lies in what is now Zhejiang province, near the coastal wetlands of eastern China. The settlement dates back to roughly 5000 BC, making it one of the oldest known Neolithic communities in the region. The environment was very different from today. The area was warm, wet, and filled with rivers, lakes, and marshy ground. For the people living there, water was everywhere. Instead of building directly on the ground, they constructed houses using wooden posts. The posts were driven into the earth, creating a raised platform above the wet surface. Wooden beams connected the supports, and a floor was built above them. The design protected the living area from damp ground, and may also have helped with flooding, animals, and insects. The discovery was especially important because wood normally disappears quickly. In most archaeological sites, organic materials decay within centuries. At Hamudu, the wet conditions helped preserve wooden remains. Archaeologists discovered large quantities of timber, including posts, beams, flooring, and other wooden structures. For prehistoric archaeology, this was extraordinary. The preserved wood revealed how the houses were constructed. Builders selected suitable trees, shaped the timber, and joined pieces together. Some wooden components show evidence of sophisticated joinery. The people of Hamudu were not simply placing branches together. They had developed practical woodworking techniques, and understood how to create stable structures from timber. The settlement also provides evidence of rice cultivation. Rice was an important part of the Hamudu economy, and archaeologists discovered large quantities of rice remains. This is significant because it shows that early farming communities in the lower Yangtze were already cultivating rice thousands of years ago. The wetlands that made ordinary construction difficult were also valuable agricultural environments. The people of Hamudu did not rely only on farming. They also hunted, fished, collected wild plants, and used resources from the surrounding wetlands. The rivers and marshes provided fish, shellfish, and other food. The settlement was therefore closely connected to its environment. The water was not simply something to avoid. It was part of everyday life. Archaeologists also discovered pottery, stone tools, bone implements, and wooden objects. Some tools were designed for working wood, while others were used in agriculture or food preparation. These objects help reconstruct ordinary activities inside the settlement. People cooked, processed food, made tools, and worked with materials from the surrounding landscape. The pottery is especially interesting. Some vessels were carefully shaped, while others carried decorative patterns. The designs reveal a distinctive artistic tradition. The people of Hamudu were not only concerned with survival, they also created objects with visual meaning and craftsmanship. Their material culture shows a community with established traditions. The houses themselves were probably larger than the surviving archaeological remains suggest. Wooden walls, roofs, and other upper structures have mostly disappeared. What remains are the foundations, posts, and fragments preserved in the wet soil. From these pieces, archaeologists can reconstruct the general form of the settlement. The raised architecture may have had several advantages. Keeping the floor above the ground would reduce contact with moisture. It could also make movement easier across wet terrain. If seasonal flooding occurred, an elevated structure could provide additional protection. The exact reason for the design is uncertain, but the environment clearly influenced the architecture. Hamudu also tells us something important about early settled life. These people were not simply moving from place to place. They invested in permanent buildings, cultivated crops, stored food, and developed specialized tools. A settlement like this required planning. People had to maintain houses, manage agricultural land, and organize access to the surrounding resources. The woodworking is one of the strongest clues to their abilities. Some joints were carefully shaped, allowing wooden pieces to fit together. The builders understood how different pieces needed to support one another. Without metal nails, they relied on the properties of wood itself. The result was architecture that could survive in a difficult environment. Over generations, the settlement changed. Buildings were repaired, new structures were added, and old wooden elements were replaced. The community continued adapting to the landscape. Eventually, the Hamudu settlement was abandoned. The reasons are not completely understood. Environmental changes, flooding, or shifts in settlement patterns may have played a role. The wet soil then became an unexpected protector. Mud covered the wooden structures, reducing exposure to oxygen. The wood remained buried, while the settlement disappeared from the surface. Plants grew over the area, the landscape changed, and thousands of years passed. When archaeologists excavated Hamudu in the 20th century, they found something rare. Wood, large amounts of it. Posts, beams, tools, and fragments of buildings were preserved beneath the soil. The discovery transformed our understanding of Neolithic life in eastern China. The site also showed that early Chinese farming communities were highly adapted to their environment. They did not simply copy building methods from dry regions. They developed architecture suited to wetlands. They cultivated rice, used waterways, and built raised structures. The landscape shaped their technology. The stone circles aligned to the stars in northern Japan. In the mountains of northern Japan, ancient people built enormous circles from stone. 2 great rings, hundreds of carefully placed stones, and at the center, strange arrangements that may have been connected with the sky. This is the Oyu stone circles, a prehistoric ceremonial site in Akita Prefecture. The stone circles were built around 4,000 years ago, during Japan's Jomon period. The Jomon people lived long before Japan's historic kingdoms appeared. They hunted, gathered wild plants, fished, made pottery, and lived in settled communities. But they also created large ceremonial landscapes. Oyu is one of the most remarkable. The site contains two major stone circles, known as Manza and Nonakado. Each consists of stones arranged into enormous circular patterns. From the ground, the layout can seem confusing. Individual stones appear scattered across the grass. But from above, the overall design becomes much clearer. The circles were carefully planned. The Manza circle is especially large. It measures roughly 48 meters across, making it one of the largest known stone circle structures from Jomon, Japan. The stones were brought together, arranged into rings, and combined with smaller stone features. This was not a random collection of rocks. Someone decided where each stone should go. At the center of the circles, researchers found unusual arrangements of stones. Some form small radial patterns, almost like spokes extending from a central point. These structures have sometimes been interpreted as representing the sun, or as part of a calendar system, but the exact meaning remains uncertain. The connection with astronomy is one of the most fascinating questions. The circles are positioned within a landscape where the horizon is clearly visible. Researchers have studied relationships between the stone arrangements, the movement of the sun, and other celestial events. Some alignments appear intentional, but proving exactly what the builders intended is much harder. The Jomon people did not leave written records. There are no inscriptions explaining the circles. No surviving calendar tells us how they were used. And there is no ancient text describing ceremonies at Oyu. Everything has to be reconstructed from the stones, the surrounding archaeology, and comparisons with other Jomon sites. The stones themselves are interesting. Many are relatively small, but some were transported from locations away from the immediate site. Moving stones across the landscape required effort. People had to select them, carry them, and position them precisely. Doing this on such a large scale suggests organized community activity. The circles may have been connected with ceremonies surrounding death. Human remains have been found in association with some Jomon stone circle sites, and Oyu appears to have been more than a simple settlement. The arrangement of the stones, the central features, and the surrounding archaeological evidence suggests that people gathered here for special purposes. Exactly what those ceremonies involved remains unknown. The Jomon world was very different from later agricultural civilizations. These communities were not building giant cities, writing laws, or constructing royal palaces, yet they were capable of monumental construction. Oyu shows that complex social and ceremonial activity existed long before Japan's historic period. The site also reveals the importance of landscape. The stone circles were not built in isolation. The surrounding mountains, hills, and horizon were part of the setting. For people who watched the sun and stars without modern lighting, the sky would have been an enormous part of everyday life. Seasonal changes could be observed directly. The position of the sun changed across the horizon, and the stars provided familiar patterns in the night sky. This has led to comparisons with other prehistoric stone monuments around the world. Stonehenge, Newgrange, and other megalithic sites also raise questions about ancient astronomy, but Oyu developed independently within the Jomon world. Its design reflects Japanese prehistoric traditions, not a copy of European monuments. The circles were eventually abandoned. The people who built them disappeared into the archaeological record. Vegetation covered the stones, and the site slowly became part of the surrounding landscape. For thousands of years, the circles remained quiet. The original ceremonies were forgotten. Modern archaeology eventually revealed their true scale. Excavations uncovered the circular arrangements, central stone structures, and surrounding features. Researchers could begin reconstructing how the site was organized. What had looked like scattered stones turned out to be a carefully planned ceremonial complex. The biggest mystery is still its purpose. Was it a calendar? A burial ground? A ceremonial gathering place? A location for observing the sky? Perhaps several of these functions were connected. Ancient monuments rarely had only one meaning. The people who used Oyu may have understood relationships between the dead, the seasons, the landscape, and the heavens, in ways we can no longer fully reconstruct. The stone circles also show that prehistoric Japanese communities could organize large groups of people. Creating a monument nearly 50 meters wide required planning. The stones had to be collected, transported, arranged, and maintained. That suggests that the site had enough importance to bring people together. The gold sunbird cut thinner than paper. More than 3,000 years ago, an ancient Chinese craftsman created something remarkably delicate, a tiny golden disc cut into an intricate pattern, with 4 birds appearing to circle around the center. The gold is incredibly thin, yet the design remains recognizable after thousands of years. This is the Jinsha sunbird, one of the most famous treasures discovered at the ancient Jinsha site in Chengdu. The Jinsha site was discovered in 2001 in what is now Chengdu, Sichuan province. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of an ancient settlement, along with large quantities of jade, ivory, bronze, pottery, and gold objects. Among the discoveries, the small golden sunbird immediately stood out. The object is made from extremely thin gold sheet. It is only around a millimeter thick, making it surprisingly delicate. Yet the craftsman managed to cut an elaborate design into the metal. The center contains a circular form, surrounded by 4 birds. Their bodies appear to move around the central shape, creating a sense of rotation. The design is simple at first glance, but the symmetry is remarkable. 4 birds are arranged around the center, their heads facing outward, while their bodies follow the circular pattern. The whole image forms a balanced composition. There are no unnecessary details. Every cut in the gold appears to have been carefully planned. The object is often associated with the ancient Shu civilization, a culture that flourished in the Chengdu region long before the Qin conquest. The Shu left behind distinctive artistic traditions, but very few written records survive from their own period. Much of what we know comes from archaeology. The Jinsha discoveries have therefore become extremely important for understanding this ancient society. The sunbird is particularly interesting because of its possible symbolism. The central shape is often interpreted as the sun, while the 4 surrounding birds may represent movement, cycles, or a connection with solar beliefs. But the exact meaning is not known. The ancient people who created the design did not leave an explanation beside it. Its symbolism has to be reconstructed from the object itself and from other discoveries. Bird imagery appears in Shu culture in several forms. Birds were represented on objects, decorations, and other archaeological materials. This suggests that birds may have held an important symbolic role, but we should be careful about assuming exactly what they represented. The sunbird may have been connected with religious beliefs, royal authority, or ceremonies. Its original purpose remains uncertain. The craftsmanship is perhaps the most impressive feature. Gold is a soft and workable metal, but producing such a thin sheet required skill. The craftsman had to prepare the metal, flatten it, and then create the intricate design without destroying the fragile material. The cuts had to be controlled. One major mistake could ruin the entire piece. The object is also extremely light. It does not look like a heavy piece of treasure. Instead, it resembles a delicate sheet of gold jewelry that may have allowed it to be attached to clothing, a ceremonial object, or another larger structure. Exactly how it was used is still debated. The Jinsha site itself was much larger than the sunbird. Archaeologists discovered evidence of an important settlement, with large quantities of valuable materials. Jade was particularly common. The people of Jinsha worked with stone, bronze, gold, and other materials. The site appears to have been an important political and ceremonial center. Some discoveries suggest connections with the earlier Sangsingdui culture, another major archaeological tradition in Sichuan. Both sites contain distinctive bronze and gold objects, as well as evidence of sophisticated ritual activity. Jinsha may represent a later phase of the same broader cultural world. The transition between the two remains an important area of research. The discovery of the sunbird also changed the way people viewed ancient Sichuan. For a long time, the region was less familiar internationally than the better-known centers of ancient China. Then archaeology began revealing something remarkable. There had been complex societies here, with their own artistic traditions, religious practices, and advanced craftsmanship. The gold bird became a symbol of that forgotten world. The object may also have had a ceremonial role. Gold was rare, and producing such a delicate piece required specialized craftsmanship. That suggests it was probably not an ordinary household object. It may have belonged to an elite, a religious specialist, or a ceremonial context. But its exact function remains unknown. The Jinsha people also created large and impressive objects. Archaeologists found elephant tusks, jade ornaments, bronze objects, and other ritual materials. These discoveries suggest that the society had access to extensive resources. Some materials came from far beyond Chengdu. The settlement was connected to a wider network of exchange. Then, the world of Jinsha changed. The settlement was eventually abandoned, and its buildings disappeared beneath the landscape. Centuries passed. The Shu civilization became part of ancient history, while its material remains remained buried. The sunbird stayed hidden in the ground, protected from the outside world. When archaeologists discovered it, the delicate gold object immediately attracted attention. Unlike a massive statue, it could fit easily into someone's hand, but its size does not reflect its importance. The tiny design preserved evidence of artistic ideas, religious symbolism, and technical skill from an ancient culture. Today, the Jinsha sunbird is one of the most recognizable symbols of ancient Sichuan archaeology. Its four birds continue to circle the central design, frozen in gold. We can admire the precision, study the symbolism, and compare it with other ancient discoveries. But the people who created it left no clear explanation. Why four birds? Why the circular form? Was it meant to represent the sun? Was it connected with a particular deity? Or did it carry a meaning that modern researchers have not yet recognized? These questions remain open. The ancient fortress city of Yoshinagari. In the fields of Saga Prefecture, a massive ancient settlement once stood behind deep defensive moats. There were watchtowers, raised floor buildings, storehouses, burial grounds, and large ceremonial structures. This is Yoshinagari, one of the most important archaeological sites from Japan's Yayoi period. Yoshinagari developed between roughly the 3rd century BC and the 3rd century AD, a period when Japan was undergoing major changes. Rice cultivation was spreading, permanent settlements were becoming more common, and communities were becoming increasingly organized. Yoshinagari preserves evidence of that transformation. The settlement eventually became enormous. A large outer moat surrounded much of the community, creating a defensive boundary around the settlement. The moat was not simply a shallow ditch. Parts of it were dug into a deep V-shaped profile, making it much harder to cross. Inside, additional fences and defensive structures strengthened the settlement. Watchtowers stood above the walls. From these elevated positions, people could see across the surrounding landscape. They could watch approaching visitors, protect important areas, and perhaps communicate with other parts of the settlement. The presence of multiple watchtowers suggests that security had become an important concern. This was not just a village. Yoshinagari grew into a highly organized center, with different areas serving different purposes. There were residential zones, storage areas, workspaces, ceremonial buildings, and special burial areas. The layout suggests that society had become increasingly divided. Different people may have had different roles and different levels of authority. The northern part of the settlement is especially interesting. A large inner enclosure contains substantial buildings, including structures believed to have been used for ceremonies and political activities. The area was heavily protected, and its architecture was different from the ordinary residential sections. This suggests that important people gathered there. Another area contained large quantities of storage facilities. Rice and other goods could be collected, stored, and managed within the settlement. This tells us something important about Yoshinagari. Food was no longer simply gathered for immediate consumption. Surpluses could be stored, controlled, and distributed. That kind of system can support a much larger and more organized community. The settlement also contains extensive burial areas. Burial jars were placed in organized groups, creating large cemetery zones. A special northern burial mound has also been identified, and is thought to have been associated with successive rulers or important members of the community. The relationship between the living and the dead appears to have been important. The settlement was not only a place to live, it was also a place where ancestors were remembered, leaders were buried, and ceremonies were performed. The location of these burial areas within the larger settlement suggests that death remained closely connected with the community. Archaeologists have also discovered weapons, bronze objects, farming tools, glass beads, and other valuable materials. These discoveries reveal a society that was connected to a wider world. Materials and ideas were moving across East Asia, and Yoshinagari was part of those changing networks. The appearance of weapons is particularly significant. Earlier prehistoric communities did not necessarily require large defensive systems, but by the Yayoi period, competition between communities appears to have increased. Yoshinagari's expanding moats, fences, and watchtowers suggest that protection had become a serious concern. Rice agriculture also changed the way people lived. Once communities depended heavily on cultivated fields, land and food production became more important. Harvests could be stored, territory could be defended, and control over resources could increase the power of certain groups. Yoshinagari provides physical evidence of this transformation. The settlement was also remarkably large for its time. Its size has led researchers to consider whether Yoshinagari may have been more than an ordinary village, perhaps functioning as the center of a larger political community. The site's organization has even been compared with descriptions of the ancient polity of Yamatai in early Chinese chronicles. But this identification remains debated. The archaeology is real. The connection is a hypothesis. That uncertainty is important. For decades, researchers have wondered whether Yoshinagari could be connected with the mysterious polity described in Chinese historical records. The dates and general region have attracted attention, but there is no inscription at Yoshinagari saying, "This is Yamatai." So the question remains open. The discovery of Yoshinagari itself was almost accidental. The area had been considered for industrial development, but archaeological investigations revealed that the hills contained an enormous Yayoi settlement. Research beginning in the 1980s demonstrated the extraordinary importance of the site, and development plans were reconsidered. What archaeologists found beneath the ground changed the picture of ancient Japan. The remains showed that Yayoi society was not simply a collection of small farming villages. Some communities had developed large defensive settlements, specialized areas, burial systems, and structures associated with political and ceremonial activity. Yoshinagari became one of the clearest examples. The wooden architecture is also important. Many buildings were constructed from timber, including raised floor structures and large buildings. Wood normally disappears over time, but traces of posts, beams, and other construction elements survived in the archaeological record. These remains allow researchers to reconstruct parts of the settlement. Imagine the settlement when it was alive. Smoke rising from cooking fires, people working in the fields, rice being stored, craftsmen producing tools, guards standing above the walls, and ceremonies taking place inside the protected enclosures. The settlement would have been busy. It was a community organized around farming, trade, defense, and ritual. Then, the world changed again. The Yayoi period eventually ended. Political systems developed into new forms, and Yoshinagari lost its importance. The buildings disappeared, the wooden structures decayed, and vegetation covered the remains. For centuries, the settlement existed only beneath the ground. Modern archaeology brought it back. Excavations revealed the moats, burials, buildings, tools, weapons, and countless small objects. The giant candelabra carved into the desert. The monument is carved into a sandy hillside on the northern face of the Paracas Peninsula. From the ground, it can be difficult to understand what you are looking at. The shape is enormous. Its central line rises from the base, while long branches extend outward on either side. The entire design can be seen most clearly from the surrounding sea. That location has made the candelabra especially intriguing. The geoglyph measures roughly 120 meters from top to bottom. Its lines were created by removing the darker surface layer, revealing the lighter soil beneath. The technique is surprisingly simple. There was no need to move massive stones or construct walls. Instead, the ancient artists changed the surface of the desert itself. The result has survived for centuries. The desert environment helped protect it. The Paracas Peninsula receives very little rainfall. There is almost no regular vegetation covering the slope. Because of this, the carved lines have remained visible for an extraordinary length of time. In wetter regions, a monument like this might have disappeared. Here, the dry climate became an unexpected protector. The exact age of the candelabra remains uncertain. It is generally associated with the ancient cultures of the Paracas region, and has often been discussed in connection with the first millennium BC and later pre-Columbian traditions. But directly dating a geoglyph is difficult. The surface itself does not provide a simple date. Researchers must instead compare its construction with nearby archaeological evidence. The people who created it had no modern machinery. They did not need it. The design could have been produced by scraping away the upper surface, creating shallow but wide channels. Even so, making a monument more than 100 meters long required planning. Someone had to determine the shape, organize the work, and reproduce the design across the hillside. The shape itself creates another mystery. From a distance, it looks surprisingly recognizable. The central stem rises vertically, while curved branches spread outward. This is why modern visitors call it a candelabra. But the ancient people who created it may never have thought of it that way. The original name is lost. Its true meaning is unknown. Several interpretations have been proposed. One possibility is that it had a religious or ceremonial purpose. The Paracas region contains many ancient settlements and burial sites, and the people who lived here developed complex traditions involving ritual and the dead. The enormous geoglyph may have been connected with those beliefs, but there is no inscription explaining its purpose. Another possibility involves navigation. The candelabra is positioned on a prominent coastal slope and can be seen from the ocean. Ancient sailors approaching the Paracas Peninsula may have been able to recognize it from offshore. It could have served as a landmark, helping people identify the coastline. This is possible, but it has not been proven. Its visibility from the sea is certainly remarkable. Imagine approaching the peninsula by boat centuries ago. The coastline would have appeared as a vast stretch of dry desert. Then, on the hillside, a giant geometric figure would come into view. It would have been impossible to miss from certain directions. That visibility may have been intentional. Some have also suggested that the candelabra had astronomical meaning. The shape's orientation, its position on the peninsula, and its relationship with the surrounding horizon have encouraged different theories, but there is no clear evidence showing that it functioned as an astronomical calendar. The possibility remains interesting, but it should not be confused with established fact. The Paracas Peninsula itself was an important region long before the famous Nazca lines were created. The Paracas culture developed here, producing distinctive pottery, textiles, and elaborate burial traditions. Their textiles are especially famous, with intricate designs and carefully preserved colors. The candelabra exists within this wider cultural landscape. The desert also preserved other traces of ancient life. Burial sites contained human remains, pottery, tools, and textiles. These discoveries show that the region was not an empty desert. People lived here, traveled across it, and developed complex relationships with the coastline and surrounding landscape. The candelabra was part of that world. One of the most fascinating questions is why the monument was placed on a slope. If the purpose was simply ritual, why make it so large? If it was a landmark, why create such a strange design? If it represented something religious, what exactly did the branches mean? We have no ancient explanation. The people who created the monument left the image, but not the instructions. The design also resembles a plant or tree in some interpretations. Others have compared it to a trident, a cactus, or a ceremonial object. These comparisons tell us more about modern viewers than the ancient meaning. The shape can be interpreted in many ways, because its original symbolism has been lost. Unlike a stone monument, the candelabra can be changed by the environment. Wind moves sand across the peninsula. Small sections can gradually erode. Human activity can also damage the surface. Protecting the geoglyph therefore requires careful management. Its survival depends partly on preserving the fragile desert landscape around it. For centuries, the candelabra remained part of the coastal landscape. People came and went, cultures changed, and new civilizations appeared, but the enormous figure remained carved into the hillside. Its creators disappeared from living memory, while the monument continued to overlook the Pacific. When modern travelers began documenting the Paracas Peninsula, the candelabra became internationally famous. Its enormous scale, unusual shape, and uncertain purpose attracted attention. It was soon compared with other famous geoglyphs in Peru, especially the Nazca lines. But the two traditions should not automatically be treated as the same. They belong to different places, and their exact relationships remain uncertain. The candelabra is sometimes surrounded by extraordinary theories. Some claim it was created by an unknown civilization, or even by visitors from somewhere beyond Earth. But archaeology does not require those explanations. Ancient people were perfectly capable of creating large landscape designs, using simple tools, careful planning, and organized labor. The real mystery is not whether humans could build it. The mystery is why they chose to. That question remains unanswered. Perhaps it marked a sacred place. Perhaps it guided travelers. Perhaps it represented a religious symbol. Or perhaps its meaning combined several different ideas. The evidence is not strong enough to choose one explanation with certainty. The goddess temple with jade eyes. High in the hills of northeastern China, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a prehistoric ceremonial center. Inside, they found something unexpected: jade objects, clay figures, and a mysterious human-like head with striking eyes. This was New Heliang, a ritual complex built more than 5,000 years ago by the Hongshan culture. New Heliang lies in what is now Liaoning province, near the border between Liaoning and Inner Mongolia. The site dates to roughly 5,000 years ago, during the late Neolithic period. The people who built it lived long before the first dynasties of historical China, yet they were already creating large ceremonial structures, complex burials, and remarkable works of art. One of the most unusual discoveries came from what archaeologists call the goddess temple. The structure was built from earth and stone, and contained fragments of human-like clay figures. Some were life-sized, while others were smaller. The figures appear to have been deliberately created for ritual purposes, but exactly who they represented remains unknown. Among the most striking features are the eyes. Some of the clay figures were decorated with carefully formed facial details, giving them an almost lifelike appearance. The discovery of jade objects nearby adds another layer of mystery. Jade was extremely valuable to prehistoric communities in this region. It required skill to shape, and many pieces appear to have had ceremonial significance. The Hongshan culture is especially famous for its jade. Archaeologists have discovered carved pendants, animal-shaped objects, and mysterious forms whose exact meanings remain uncertain. Some resemble pigs or dragons, while others are abstract. These objects were not ordinary tools. They appear to have been connected with ritual, status, or beliefs about the supernatural. New Heliang was not simply a single temple. It was a large ceremonial landscape. Archaeologists have identified stone structures, burial mounds, altars, and other ritual features spread across the area. The placement of these monuments suggests that the landscape itself was important. People were not only building individual structures, they were creating a sacred environment. The burials are particularly important. Some individuals were placed beneath large stone mounds, along with valuable jade objects. This suggests that certain people held special status. The amount of labor invested in their graves, and the presence of rare objects, indicate that these were not ordinary burials. The society appears to have had important social distinctions. The goddess temple may have been connected with these beliefs. The clay figures could represent female deities, ancestors, or supernatural beings. The term goddess temple is a modern archaeological name, not a name preserved from the Hongshan people themselves. We do not know exactly what the figures represented. The famous eyes make the sculptures especially memorable. They were created with unusual attention to the face. Some fragments include painted or inserted details, giving the figures a strangely human appearance. The effect is surprising, especially considering their age. More than 5,000 years ago, an artist was deliberately creating a powerful human-like face. The people who made these sculptures had no written language that survives from this period. There are no inscriptions explaining the figures. No ancient text tells us which deity was worshipped, or what rituals took place inside the temple. The archaeological remains provide clues, but the beliefs themselves remain largely silent. The construction of New Heliang also reveals an organized society. Building ceremonial platforms, stone tombs, and large ritual structures required labor. Workers had to move stone, prepare earth, and construct monuments across the landscape. This suggests that Hongshan communities could organize large groups of people. The jade objects reveal another level of craftsmanship. Jade is extremely hard. Shaping it with prehistoric tools would have taken considerable time. The craftsmen had to grind and polish the stone gradually, creating smooth surfaces and carefully controlled shapes. Some pieces are remarkably thin and detailed. Their production was clearly not a casual activity. Why was jade so important? That remains uncertain. Across later Chinese history, jade became strongly associated with status, purity, and ritual. But we should not automatically assume the Hongshan people had exactly the same beliefs. Their own symbolic system may have been very different. The objects simply show that jade held unusual importance. The landscape around New Heliang may have contributed to its importance. The site sits among hills and valleys, with wide views across the surrounding region. The monuments were positioned within this natural environment. The combination of mountains, stone, burials, and ceremonial structures created a powerful setting. Eventually, the Hongshan culture declined. The communities that built New Heliang disappeared, or changed into later cultural traditions. Their monuments were abandoned. The temple collapsed. The clay figures broke, and the jade objects were buried with the dead. Thousands of years passed. The remains were eventually discovered by modern archaeologists. Excavations revealed the extraordinary scale of the site. The goddess temple, burial mounds, stone structures, and jade objects together showed that the Hongshan people had developed a complex ceremonial tradition. They were not simply isolated farming villages. New Heliang changed how researchers understood prehistoric northeastern China. It showed that large-scale ritual activity existed long before the better-known dynasties. Communities were already creating sacred centers, building monuments, and producing sophisticated art. The history of Chinese civilization was clearly much older and more complicated than previously understood. Yet the most mysterious objects remain the human figures. Who were they? Were they gods? Ancestors? Ritual participants? Or symbolic representations of something else? The broken faces cannot answer. The jade cannot answer. And the temple itself contains no written explanation. The three-tier pyramid that towered over the Maya world. High in the mountains of Chiapas, an enormous ancient city rises from the jungle. Its buildings climb up a steep hillside, one level above another, until the highest temples seem to hang above the valley. This is Tonina, a powerful Maya city whose rulers once controlled an important part of the region. Tonina flourished during the classic Maya period, especially between the 6th and 9th centuries. Unlike many Maya cities built across broad plains, Tonina was constructed on a natural hill. The builders took advantage of the slope, adding huge terraces, platforms, stairways, and temples over generations. The entire hillside was transformed into a massive ceremonial complex. The center of the city was the Acropolis. It was not one simple pyramid. Instead, it was a series of enormous platforms stacked against the hillside. Each level contained plazas, buildings, altars, and temples. As people climbed higher, the architecture became more monumental. At the summit, the highest structures overlooked the entire valley. The scale of the Acropolis is what makes Tonina so unusual. The Maya did not simply place a pyramid on the landscape. They reshaped the landscape itself. Stone and earth were added to the natural slope, creating artificial terraces that rose hundreds of feet above the valley floor. The result was almost like a giant pyramid built in stages. These different levels probably had different purposes. Some spaces were open plazas, where larger groups could gather. Other areas were more restricted, likely connected with rulers and religious ceremonies. Temples occupied some of the highest positions. The higher someone climbed, the deeper they moved into the ceremonial center of the city. Tonina was also a powerful military kingdom. Its rulers fought against neighboring Maya states, and their victories were recorded in stone. One of the most important conflicts involved Palenque, a major kingdom located to the west. In the 7th century, Tonina captured the Palenque ruler, Kinnick Kanbalam II. The event was recorded in Maya inscriptions. This was more than a military victory. For Maya rulers, capturing an important enemy could demonstrate political power. Monuments could then preserve that victory for generations. At Tonina, images of defeated captives appear in the city's sculpture. They were shown bound, defeated, and placed beneath the authority of the victorious ruler. The city's artists were highly skilled. They carved limestone monuments, royal figures, captives, religious imagery, and inscriptions. Some sculptures are remarkably detailed. Clothing, jewelry, headdresses, and weapons were carefully represented. These carvings provide important information about Maya society. Tonina also contained ball courts, another important feature of Maya cities. The ancient Maya ball game was not simply a sport. It could be connected with ritual, political events, and religious beliefs. The ball courts were therefore part of the city's ceremonial landscape. The Acropolis was constantly changing. Different rulers added new buildings, expanded older platforms, and created new monuments. Because of this, the site contains layers from different periods. A temple built by one ruler could later be covered, modified, or incorporated into another structure. The city was constantly rebuilding itself. Some sculptures were also reused. Carved stones were moved from older buildings and placed into later structures. This suggests that the Maya did not always treat old monuments as untouchable. Earlier architecture could become part of a new political landscape. The past was physically incorporated into the future. The position of Tonina was important as well. From the Acropolis, the surrounding valley could be seen for a considerable distance. Mountains formed the horizon, while settlements and agricultural land stretched below. The city therefore had a commanding position over the surrounding landscape. Its architecture made that position even more dramatic. For centuries, Tonina remained an important Maya center. Then, like many cities across the Maya world, its political system began to change. The great period of monument building eventually slowed. Rulers stopped commissioning the same scale of monuments, and the city gradually lost its importance. The reasons for this decline are not completely understood. Warfare, political instability, environmental pressures, and changing trade networks may all have contributed. There was no single explanation for the transformation of the entire Maya world. Different cities experienced different histories. Tonina was one of the later centers to remain active. Eventually, the temples were abandoned. The stairways became overgrown, buildings collapsed, and vegetation covered the stone. The Maya people did not disappear, but the political world that created Tonina's monuments changed dramatically. The city became a place of ruins. For centuries, the Acropolis remained hidden beneath vegetation. The enormous terraces were still there, but much of the architecture was difficult to recognize. Modern archaeology eventually revealed the true scale of the site. Excavations uncovered temples, plazas, sculptures, tombs, ball courts, and inscriptions. The discoveries showed that Tonina had been far more powerful than its remote location might suggest. It was a major political center, with its own rulers, military ambitions, religious traditions, and monumental architecture. The Acropolis was essentially a giant statement of that power. The most fascinating thing about Tonina is how closely the natural mountain and the artificial architecture became connected. The builders did not destroy the hillside. They used it. They added to it, layer by layer, until the natural slope became a monumental staircase rising toward the sky. We can still see traces of the people who made this possible. The carved stones preserve royal names, military victories, and religious imagery, but most of the population remains invisible. Farmers, builders, stone workers, craftspeople, and families supported the city, yet their individual stories were rarely recorded. The rock-cut caves of Undavali, along the banks of the Krishna River. A massive stone structure rises directly from a hillside, but this is not a building constructed from separate blocks. It was carved into the living rock inside. Several levels contain halls, pillars, sculptures, and a remarkable reclining figure. This is the Undavali Caves, one of the most impressive rock-cut monuments in Andhra Pradesh. The caves are located near Vijayawada, in the state of Andhra Pradesh. They were carved between roughly the 4th and 7th centuries, during a period when Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism all influenced the religious landscape of the region. The complex developed over time, with different parts showing different architectural traditions. The most striking feature is the enormous multi-level facade. From outside, the caves appear almost like a stone palace built into the hillside, but the entire structure was excavated from the rock. Workers had to remove huge quantities of stone, gradually cutting deeper into the hill. Every corridor, pillar, and chamber had to be shaped by hand. The largest chamber contains rows of massive pillars. They divide the interior into different spaces, creating the impression of a monumental hall. The pillars are not identical. Some contain decorative details, while others are relatively plain. Together, they support the upper sections of the cave and give the interior a formal architectural appearance. One of the most famous sculptures inside Undavali is a huge reclining figure of Vishnu. The figure rests horizontally within the rock-cut chamber, creating one of the most recognizable images at the site. Vishnu is shown in a reclining form associated with the cosmic serpent Shesha. The sculpture is enormous compared with the surrounding human scale. The reclining Vishnu is especially important because it shows how rock-cut architecture could combine engineering, sculpture, and religious symbolism. The artists were not simply decorating an existing cave. They were creating the entire environment around the image. The chamber, pillars, walls, and sculpture all formed part of one carefully planned space. The caves also contain images of other Hindu deities, along with decorative carvings. Some parts of the complex preserve earlier Buddhist associations. This mixture reflects the changing religious environment of the region. The caves were not created during a single moment. Different communities and traditions influenced the monument over time. The location beside the Krishna River was also significant. Rivers were important routes through ancient India, connecting settlements, agricultural areas, and centers of trade. A religious complex positioned near such a landscape could attract visitors, pilgrims, and travelers. The surrounding hills also provided a natural setting for rock-cut architecture. Creating a monument like Undavali required enormous effort. Workers had to stand directly against the rock face, remove stone, measure spaces, and maintain the correct proportions. A mistake could not simply be repaired by replacing a block. Once the rock was removed, it was gone. The entire design had to be planned carefully. The upper levels are particularly interesting. From outside, the facade gives the impression of several stories. Inside, the spaces connect through carved passages and openings. The architects use the natural slope of the hill, turning it into a multi-level sanctuary. The result is both practical and monumental. The caves also show the development of Indian rock-cut architecture. Across India, religious communities carved temples, monasteries, prayer halls, and shrines directly into cliffs. Instead of constructing separate buildings, they created architecture inside mountains. Undavali belongs to this long tradition. Over the centuries, the religious use of the caves changed. Later, Hindu traditions became dominant, and the sculptures and spaces were incorporated into a Hindu sacred landscape. The monument survived even as political powers around it changed. Dynasties rose, kingdoms disappeared, and new religious institutions developed. The caves remained. Unlike a freestanding temple, the Undavali complex could not simply collapse completely. Its walls were part of the hill itself, although surfaces weathered, and sections were damaged. The basic structure remained protected by the surrounding rock. That is one reason the monument has survived for so long. The exact history of every section is still debated. Researchers can compare the carving styles, architecture, and religious imagery, but not every stage of construction can be reconstructed with certainty. The caves were modified over time, leaving behind layers of architectural history. Today, the Undavali caves remain one of Andhra Pradesh's most remarkable monuments. The enormous facade still faces the surrounding landscape, while the interiors preserve rows of stone pillars, carved figures, and the famous reclining Vishnu. The workers who created the caves are unknown. Their names were not preserved, but their work remains. The rock-cut caves of Undavali show what happens when architecture is carved rather than built. Instead of carrying stones up a hillside, ancient craftsmen removed the mountain itself. They carved halls, pillars, shrines, and enormous sculptures, creating a monument from one continuous mass of rock, more than 1,000 years later. The caves still stand beside the Krishna River, quietly preserving the skill of the people who carved an entire temple into the hillside. The temples of Bagan, across the dry plains of central Myanmar. Thousands of ancient monuments rise from the earth. Stupas, temples, monasteries, and shrines stretch for miles beside the Ayeyarwady River. This is Bagan, one of the greatest Buddhist archaeological landscapes in Southeast Asia. Bagan reached its height between the 11th and 13th centuries, when it became the capital of a powerful regional empire. During this period, the landscape changed dramatically. Kings, monks, nobles, and ordinary people supported the construction of religious monuments. Temple after temple appeared across the plain. The reason behind this enormous building program was closely connected with Buddhist belief. Donating a temple or stupa was considered an important act of religious merit. Rulers could demonstrate their devotion, while wealthy families could create monuments in memory of themselves or their relatives. Over generations, these individual acts transformed the entire landscape. Today, UNESCO records 3,595 surviving monuments within the Bagan World Heritage Property. They include temples, stupas, monasteries, and other structures connected with Buddhist practice. But these were never simply decorative buildings. They formed part of a living religious landscape. The monuments were built in many different forms. Some are small, with simple interiors and single chambers. Others are enormous, containing multiple levels, long corridors, shrines, and vaulted halls. Some were designed to be viewed from the outside. Others were meant to be entered, with darkness gradually giving way to the light around a sacred image. One of the most remarkable features of Bagan is the survival of its interior artwork. Several temples preserve murals, sculptures, stucco decoration, and inscriptions. These details are extremely valuable because they reveal aspects of medieval Burmese religious art that would otherwise have disappeared. Inside some temples, the walls were covered with painted scenes, Buddhist stories, sacred figures, patterns, and images of religious life filled the interiors. The paintings were not simply decoration. They helped communicate Buddhist teachings to people entering the temple. The architecture also reflects the changing skills of Bagan's builders. Bricks were carefully arranged, vaults were constructed, walls were strengthened, and large spaces were created without modern building equipment. Some monuments contain surprisingly sophisticated vaulted interiors. The surviving structures show how much architectural knowledge had developed during the Bagan period. The temples also had an important relationship with the surrounding landscape. Bagan lies beside the Irrawaddy River, a major waterway running through Myanmar. The river connected the region with other settlements, allowing people and goods to move across the country. Bagan's position helped the kingdom control important river transport routes. The dry landscape may seem harsh today, but agriculture supported the ancient population. Water management, farming, and river transport allowed the city to grow. The temples therefore existed within a much larger economic system. Behind every monument, there were people growing food, making bricks, transporting materials, and maintaining the religious institutions. The construction of thousands of monuments required enormous organization. Bricks had to be produced, transported, and placed correctly. Workers had to quarry or gather materials, prepare foundations, construct walls, and finish the interiors. The temples may have been religious offerings, but creating them was also a massive logistical achievement. The royal court played an important role in this process. Kings acted as major donors, supporting monasteries and temples. Building religious monuments could strengthen a ruler's relationship with the Buddhist community, while also displaying wealth and authority. Religion and political power were closely connected. By the 13th century, temple construction reached its peak. The plain had become densely filled with monuments. From certain viewpoints, the landscape would have been dominated by towers and stupas. Smoke, people, animals, and religious processions would have moved among them. Bagan was not a deserted collection of temples. It was a living capital. But the political system eventually weakened. The great period of Bagan civilization came to an end, and the city lost its position as the center of regional power. The temples remained, but the political world that had created them changed. Some monuments continued to be used, others were abandoned. Without regular maintenance, brick walls began to deteriorate. Roofs weakened, plaster fell, and vegetation slowly appeared around the structures. Yet thousands of monuments survived. Earthquakes also became a major threat. The region is seismically active, and repeated earthquakes have damaged monuments throughout Bagan's history. The 1975 earthquake caused particularly serious destruction, damaging or weakening many structures. Later conservation efforts attempted to stabilize the monuments. But preserving Bagan is not simply a matter of repairing old buildings. The entire landscape is important. The monuments, river, agricultural areas, living communities, and continuing Buddhist traditions are all connected. UNESCO describes Bagan as a complex cultural landscape rather than simply a collection of ruins. That living connection is one of the most fascinating aspects of the site. Some temples still receive visitors for worship. People continue Buddhist practices, make offerings, light candles, and maintain connections with the monuments. The ancient religious landscape therefore never completely disappeared. The temples also preserve evidence of ordinary people. Inscriptions can record donors, religious activities, and historical events. Not every monument was built by a king. Many were supported by people who wanted to create religious merit. Their names sometimes survived in stone. This gives Bagan a very different character from places dominated by a single monument. There is no single temple that explains the entire site. The story is spread across thousands of structures. Each monument represents a small part of a much larger religious and cultural movement. Some temples are almost hidden among vegetation. Others rise dramatically above the plain. Some preserve elaborate interiors, while others are little more than weathered brick shells. Together, they create an archaeological landscape unlike almost anywhere else. Standing among the ruins today, it is difficult to understand the scale of the original city. The modern landscape is quiet, but during Bagan's peak, the plain was filled with activity. Builders, monks, farmers, merchants, pilgrims, and rulers all contributed to the life of the city. Eventually, the people moved on, but they left behind an extraordinary landscape. Thousands of temples survived the collapse of the kingdom, centuries of weather, and repeated earthquakes. The buildings became archaeological monuments, but their religious meaning never completely disappeared. The four stone Buddhas of Galvihara. Deep inside the ancient city of Polonnaruwa, four enormous Buddha images were carved directly into a granite cliff. They were not built from separate blocks. The artists cut them from the living rock, leaving the figures permanently connected to the stone. This is Galvihara, one of the finest surviving monuments of medieval Sri Lanka. Galvihara was created during the reign of King Parakramabahu III in the 12th century. At that time, Polonnaruwa was the political center of Sri Lanka. The city contained monasteries, palaces, temples, reservoirs, and enormous religious monuments. Galvihara formed part of this powerful Buddhist landscape. The monument contains four main Buddha images. Two are seated. One is standing, and another is reclining. Each was carved directly into the granite. The largest reclining figure stretches for more than 14 meters, making it one of the most impressive sculptures at the site. The seated Buddhas are shown in meditation. Their faces are calm, their hands are arranged in traditional gestures, and their bodies are carefully proportioned. The sculptors worked with remarkable precision. Even small details of the robes, hands, and facial features were shaped from the hard granite. The standing Buddha is particularly interesting. The figure stands with crossed arms, a posture that has led to different interpretations for many years. Some researchers believe the statue might represent the Buddha's disciple Ananda. Others have argued that it is another representation of the Buddha. The identity remains debated. Then there is the reclining Buddha. The figure lies peacefully against the rock, with the head resting on a carved support. The pose represents the Buddha entering parinirvana, the final passing beyond the cycle of rebirth. The expression is calm, almost as if the figure is simply sleeping. The sculptors had to work directly against the cliff. They could not move the granite elsewhere. They had to remove stone around the figure, gradually revealing the shape hidden within the rock. Too much stone removed, and the sculpture could be permanently damaged. The entire process required planning and extraordinary control. The rock surface also forms part of the background. Behind the seated figures, the cliff remains visible. This creates a natural frame around the sculptures. The artists did not completely separate the figures from the mountain. Instead, the mountain became part of the monument. The images were connected with a major Buddhist monastic complex. Galvihara was probably associated with a monastery where monks lived and practiced. The monument was therefore not simply a collection of statues. It was part of a larger religious environment. People could gather here, meditate, perform rituals, and honor the Buddha. Polonnaruwa itself became a major center after the earlier capital of Anuradhapura declined. Kings expanded the city, built enormous irrigation works, and supported Buddhist institutions. Parakramabahu, I was one of the most powerful rulers of this period. His reign was marked by large construction projects across the kingdom. Galvihara reflects that wealth and organization. Creating monuments of this size required skilled workers, stonecutters, sculptors, architects, and laborers all had to cooperate. The finished statues may look effortless, but every curve was produced by removing stone. The peaceful appearance hides the enormous amount of work required. The granite itself helped preserve the monument. Stone can withstand centuries of weather. Although surfaces still become worn, some details have been softened by time, but the main forms remain remarkably clear. The faces, bodies, and robes can still be recognized. The monument also reveals the importance of Buddhist art in medieval Sri Lanka. The Buddha images are not shown as ordinary human portraits. Their calm expressions, postures, and gestures communicate religious ideas. The sculptures were designed to create a particular spiritual atmosphere. Silence, stillness, and contemplation are central to the experience. Over time, Polonnaruwa lost its position as the political center. Wars and political changes affected the city. The royal court eventually moved elsewhere, and many buildings were abandoned. The jungle gradually covered parts of the ancient city. Galvihara remained, but the world around it changed. For centuries, the stone Buddhas stood in relative isolation. Their original surroundings became overgrown, while the city that created them faded from memory. Later archaeological work revealed the enormous scale of Polonnaruwa, and Galvihara once again became one of its defining monuments. The four images are especially powerful because they form a sequence. A seated Buddha, another seated Buddha, a standing figure, And finally, the reclining Buddha. Different poses create different meanings, yet all remain connected to the same cliff. The entire group appears to have been designed as one sacred composition. The reclining Buddha is perhaps the most famous. Its enormous length makes it immediately impressive, but its expression is remarkably gentle. There is no dramatic movement, no sense of struggle. The figure simply rests, representing the Buddha's final release. The surrounding rock also contains inscriptions, providing evidence about the history of the monument and the religious community connected with it. These inscriptions help researchers understand how the site was organized, although they cannot explain every detail of the sculptures. The stone itself therefore preserves both art and fragments of history. Today, Galvihara remains one of the most important monuments in Polonnaruwa. Visitors still stand beneath the same granite cliff, looking at figures carved nearly 9 centuries ago. The surrounding city has become ruins, but the Buddhas remain remarkably complete. Nippur, the sacred city of Sumer. Thousands of years ago, in the flat plains of southern Mesopotamia, a city grew around one of the most important temples in the ancient world. Its streets were crowded with workers, its temples dominated the skyline, and clay tablets recorded everything from religious rituals to ordinary business. This was Nippur, one of the great sacred cities of ancient Sumer. Nippur stood in what is now southern Iraq, between the Euphrates and Tigris river systems. The city was occupied for thousands of years, beginning long before the rise of the great empires of Mesopotamia. But Nippur became especially important because of its connection with the god Enlil. Enlil was one of the most powerful gods in the Sumerian religious world. His main sanctuary, the Ekur Temple, made Nippur a sacred center far beyond the city itself. Nippur was not always the largest political capital. That is what makes its history unusual. Cities such as Uruk, and Babylon became powerful political centers. But Nippur held a different kind of importance. Its religious authority was enormous. Rulers who wanted legitimacy could not easily ignore the city. Control over Nippur meant access to one of the most respected religious institutions in Mesopotamia. At the center of the city stood the temple district. The Ekur sanctuary was dedicated to Enlil, and its importance continued for centuries. The temple complex was repeatedly rebuilt, expanded, and repaired by different rulers. Each generation added its own layer. The result became a record of Mesopotamian religious history. The temple was not simply a place where people came to pray. It was part of a large institution. Workers, priests, administrators, and craftsmen were connected with it. Food and goods had to be collected, stored, and distributed. Animals had to be managed, buildings maintained, and rituals organized. A temple could function almost like an economic center. This is where Nippur's clay tablets become so important. Thousands of tablets were discovered at the site. Many were written in cuneiform, one of the earliest writing systems in the world. They recorded transactions, rations, property, legal agreements, religious texts, and administrative information. Some tablets preserve surprisingly ordinary details. A clay tablet might record how much grain a worker received, or how many animals were delivered to an institution. Another might record a contract, a loan, or the transfer of property. These small documents give archaeologists a glimpse into everyday life. History was not written only by kings at Nippur. It was also written by accountants. Some tablets preserve much more than financial records. Nippur became an important center for scribal education. Students learned how to write, copy words, practice signs, and reproduce traditional texts. Exercises written by inexperienced scribes have survived. Some contain mistakes, corrections, and repeated signs. They provide a rare glimpse into how writing was actually taught. The city therefore became an important center of Mesopotamian learning. Scribes copied religious compositions, myths, and lexical lists. Some of the surviving texts became important sources for understanding Sumerian literature. Nippur helped preserve traditions that continued long after individual kingdoms disappeared. One of the most famous Sumerian stories connected with this world is the tale of Enlil and Ninlil, while other myths and hymns also survive from Nippur's scribal tradition. These texts reveal how the ancient Sumerians understood their gods, their cities, and the forces controlling their world. The tablets do something extraordinary. They allow us to hear fragments of voices from thousands of years ago. But Nippur was not only temples and tablets. People lived here. There were houses, workshops, streets, storage areas, and neighborhoods. Families cooked food, made pottery, raised children, and traded goods. The sacred city was also an ordinary city. The environment was challenging. Southern Mesopotamia was largely flat, with few natural stone resources. Building materials were therefore often based on mud brick. Mud brick was cheap, available, and practical. But it required constant maintenance. Rain, flooding, and erosion could damage buildings. As a result, ancient cities were repeatedly rebuilt. This process created enormous artificial mounds. Each new building was often constructed over the remains of an older one. Over centuries, layers accumulated. Eventually, the city became a huge mound rising above the surrounding plain. Nippur's archaeological remains preserve these layers of occupation. The city experienced the rise and fall of many Mesopotamian powers. Sumerian rulers came and went. The Akkadian Empire expanded. Ur III kings rebuilt major temples, and later Babylonian rulers controlled the region. Nippur survived through all these changes. Its religious importance helped it endure. Even powerful kings needed religious legitimacy. Rulers could present themselves as protectors of the temples, restorers of sacred buildings, and servants of the gods. At Nippur, this relationship between kingship and religion became especially visible. The city was therefore important even when it was not the political capital. Eventually, Mesopotamia changed dramatically. New empires rose, languages changed, political centers moved, and religious traditions developed. Nippur continued to be occupied for centuries, but its importance gradually declined. The temples became less central. The population decreased, and parts of the city were abandoned. The buildings eventually collapsed, mud brick walls returned to earth, streets disappeared, and wind carried dust across the ruins. What had once been one of Sumer's most important sacred cities became an archaeological mound. Modern excavations began revealing the story again. Archaeologists uncovered temple remains, houses, burials, objects, and enormous quantities of clay tablets. The tablets were especially valuable. They did not simply show that people had lived at Nippur, they told researchers what those people were doing. The writings revealed an ancient society concerned with surprisingly familiar things: food work, property, debt, education, religion, and government. The language was ancient. The writing system was unfamiliar. But the problems recorded on the tablets were often remarkably human. Perhaps that is the greatest importance of Nippur. It gives us more than monumental ruins. The temples show what ancient people built. The tablets show what they thought about, what they traded, what they owed, and how their institutions worked. Together, they create a much fuller picture of Sumerian life. The rooftop houses of Çatalhöyük, on the plains of central Turkey, an ancient settlement once stood without streets. There were no normal doorways opening onto roads, no narrow lanes between houses, and almost no open ground separating one home from another. Instead, people walked across the rooftops to enter their homes. They climbed down through openings in the ceilings. This was Çatalhöyük, one of the most remarkable settlements of the Neolithic world. Çatalhöyük was occupied more than 8,000 years ago. Its earliest major settlement dates to around 740,000 BC. The site continued developing for more than 2,000 years, as generations built, rebuilt, and expanded their homes. The result was an enormous settlement made from layers of houses. The buildings were packed closely together, walls touched walls, and there were no conventional streets running between them. Instead, the rooftops created a second level of movement. People could walk from one part of the settlement to another, moving across the flat roofs. To enter a house, they descended through an opening in the ceiling, usually using a wooden ladder. This completely changed the way the settlement functioned. The roof was not simply a roof, it was part of the living space. People could work there, move between houses, and carry out activities during warmer periods. Archaeological evidence even shows hearths and other activities taking place on rooftops. Inside the houses, the layout was surprisingly organized. A central room formed the heart of the home. There were ovens, raised platforms, storage areas, and smaller side rooms. The platforms could be used for sleeping, sitting, and other domestic activities. Beneath some of them, people buried their dead. This is one of the strangest aspects of Çatalhöyük. The living and the dead were extremely close. Burials were placed beneath house floors, often within the same buildings where families carried out everyday activities. The dead were therefore not separated into distant cemeteries. They remained physically connected to the household. The houses were repeatedly rebuilt. When a building was no longer used, a new structure could be constructed over it. Old walls became foundations. Floors were raised, and new houses gradually covered older ones. After generations, the settlement rose higher and higher. This process created the large mound visible today. It is not a natural hill. It was created by thousands of years of human occupation. House after house, floor after floor, Generation after generation, the settlement slowly accumulated into a massive archaeological mound. The walls also preserve evidence of artistic activity. People decorated some interiors with paintings, reliefs, and carefully shaped features. Red pigments were used on walls, while animals and geometric designs appeared in different buildings. Some rooms contained installations associated with bulls, including horns incorporated into the architecture. These discoveries have created many theories about Çatalhöyük. Some researchers have suggested that certain houses had special ritual importance. Others have emphasized that symbolic features were part of ordinary domestic life. The distinction between a religious building and a normal home may not have been as clear as it became in later civilizations. The settlement also challenges the idea of what an early city looked like. There were no giant palaces, no monumental stone temples, and no obvious royal district. Many houses were relatively similar in size. UNESCO considers this unusual arrangement important evidence for an early form of urban organization. The people of Çatalhöyük were also farmers. They cultivated crops, kept domesticated animals, and continued to use wild resources from the surrounding landscape. The settlement existed during a major transition, when communities were becoming increasingly dependent on agriculture and permanent settlement. But life here was not entirely peaceful or comfortable. The houses were crowded together. Waste had to be managed, and the settlement environment changed constantly. People repaired walls, replastered floors, and modified their homes. Everyday maintenance was essential. The rooftops may have helped solve some of these problems. With no streets at ground level, the roofs effectively became pathways. People could move above the houses, while the interiors remained enclosed. The settlement may have looked almost like a continuous field of flat platforms. Imagine standing there thousands of years ago. There would be no modern roads, no vehicles, no distant city skyline. Instead, you might see hundreds of mud brick houses packed tightly together, smoke rising from rooftop openings, people moving across the roofs, and ladders disappearing into the houses below. The architecture also created a strong sense of privacy. The main entrance was above, rather than opening directly onto a street. Someone entering the house would climb down through the ceiling, into the central room. The roof therefore controlled movement between the outside world and the home, but not every building followed the exact same design. Archaeologists have found variations through time. Some later phases appear to have included ground-level entrances. This shows that Çatalhöyük's architecture was not frozen. The settlement changed as its people changed. That is perhaps the most important thing about the site. Çatalhöyük was not built according to one master plan. It developed gradually. Families built houses, modified them, abandoned them, and built again. The settlement grew organically through generations. Eventually, the community began to change. The eastern mound was abandoned around 6200 BC, while occupation continued in different forms at the western mound during the following centuries. The settlement's long history gradually came to an end. The houses were left behind, roofs collapsed, walls eroded, and the landscape slowly covered the remains. Thousands of years passed. The people who once climbed across those rooftops disappeared from history, but the layers of their homes remained beneath the earth. Modern excavations revealed just how unusual the settlement had been. Researchers found houses, burials, ovens, storage rooms, painted walls, sculptures, and countless everyday objects. Together, they created an unusually detailed picture of Neolithic domestic life. Çatalhöyük is important because it shows that early settled communities could organize themselves in ways very different from later cities. There was no obvious central palace, no monumental avenue, and no enormous defensive wall. Instead, the houses themselves formed the settlement. The rooftops became roads, and the homes became the basic units of the community. The Roman city of Volubilis. Volubilis was located near the fertile plains of what is now northern Morocco. The region was rich in agricultural land, making it an important place for farming and trade. The settlement existed before Roman rule, but under the Roman Empire, it developed into a major urban center. The city became part of the Roman world during the 1st century AD. Its location connected the Mediterranean world with the interior of North Africa. Olive oil, grain, and other agricultural products were produced in the surrounding countryside. Volubilis became wealthy from this agricultural economy. One of the first things visitors notice is the enormous arch of Caracalla. The original arch was constructed in the 3rd century AD. During the reign of Emperor Caracalla, it stood along the city's main avenue, creating a monumental entrance into the heart of Volubilis. The city also contained a large basilica, in Roman cities. A A basilica was commonly used for administration, legal matters, and public business. The structure at Volubilis was one of the most important public buildings in the city. Its massive walls and arches still survive, giving an idea of its original scale. Nearby stood the Capitoline Temple. This was dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, the three major gods of the Roman state. The temple stood on an elevated platform, overlooking an important public area. Its position reflected the importance of Roman religious traditions within the city. But Volubilis was not simply a Roman military settlement. It became a complex multicultural city. Local North African traditions existed alongside Roman customs, while merchants and officials brought influences from across the Mediterranean. The result was a city where different cultural traditions could exist together. The private houses are some of the most fascinating remains. Wealthy residents built large homes around open courtyards. Rooms surrounded these central spaces, providing areas for dining, living, and receiving guests. Many houses were decorated with elaborate floor mosaics. These mosaics are among Volubilis's greatest treasures. Small pieces of colored stone and ceramic were arranged into detailed patterns. Some show geometric designs. Others depict animals, mythological figures, and scenes from ancient stories. The quality of the artwork reveals how wealthy some residents had become. One famous mosaic depicts Orpheus, the legendary musician from Greek mythology. Other mosaics show sea creatures, hunting scenes, and mythological characters. These were not random decorations. They reflected the cultural interests of wealthy Roman-era families. The houses also reveal something about daily life. Rooms were arranged around courtyards, while fountains and decorative floors created comfortable private spaces. Some homes were surprisingly large. They show that Volubilis contained a wealthy urban population, not simply farmers living beside a military outpost. The city's streets were also carefully organized. Stone paving covered major roads, and drainage systems helped manage water. Public buildings, markets, homes, and religious structures were connected through the urban layout. The city had many of the features expected from a Roman provincial center. Water was essential. Volubilis had systems for bringing water into the city and distributing it where needed. Fountains, baths, and private homes depended on this infrastructure. Roman urban life required reliable water supplies, and Volubilis was no exception. The surrounding countryside was just as important as the city itself. Olive cultivation became especially significant. Oil could be produced locally, stored, and transported to other regions. The wealth generated by agriculture helped support the city's buildings and public monuments. But Volubilis eventually faced major political changes. Roman control over the region weakened, and the city was gradually disconnected from the wider Roman imperial system. By the 3rd century, the Roman administration withdrew from much of the area. Volubilis continued to exist, but its role changed. The city did not suddenly disappear. People continued living there for centuries. Buildings were repaired, old spaces were reused, and new communities occupied parts of the settlement. The transition from Roman city to later settlement was gradual. Eventually, the city was largely abandoned. Buildings fell into ruin. Roofs collapsed, and vegetation covered parts of the streets. The mosaics disappeared beneath layers of soil. Volubilis became a forgotten landscape. For centuries, the ruins remained relatively quiet. Then archaeological excavations began revealing the city again. Researchers uncovered streets, temples, houses, mosaics, inscriptions, and public buildings. The scale of Volubilis slowly became clear. The discoveries also showed that Roman North Africa was far more developed than a simple frontier region. Cities such as Volubilis had wealthy residents, public institutions, religious buildings, complex infrastructure, and connections across the Mediterranean. The Roman world extended far beyond Italy. Yet Volubilis also preserves evidence of the people who lived there before and after Roman rule. The city was shaped by local traditions, Roman institutions, and later North African cultures. Its history cannot be reduced to one civilization. It was a place of transition, where different worlds met. Today, the ruins spread across the Moroccan countryside. The surrounding fields remain open, and the distant hills frame the ancient city. The broken columns are quiet, but the mosaics remain surprisingly detailed. They preserve scenes created almost 2,000 years ago. The ancient city of Volubilis reminds us that the Roman Empire was not only a story of Rome itself. Its influence reached deep into North Africa, where cities grew around agriculture, trade, religion, and Roman administration. Volubilis eventually lost its place in that world, but its streets and mosaics survived. Today, the ruins still stand beneath the Moroccan sky, preserving the remains of a city where Roman and North African history met. The ancient villages of Bassari country. In the mountains of southeastern Senegal, ancient villages are scattered across a rugged landscape. Stone houses, terraced fields, granaries, and settlements built into the hillsides all reflect a way of life shaped by the mountains. This is Bassari country, a cultural landscape where archaeology and living traditions remain closely connected. Bassari country lies in the remote southeastern corner of Senegal, near the borders with Guinea and Mali. The region is known for its hills, rocky plateaus, deep valleys, and isolated settlements. For centuries, communities adapted their homes and agriculture to this difficult terrain. The landscape is part of what makes the region so unusual. Instead of large cities, there are small settlements spread across the hills. Houses were constructed from local materials, often using stone, earth, wood, and thatch. The buildings were designed for the environment around them. Some settlements were positioned on elevated ground. From these locations, people could look across the valleys, while the surrounding terrain provided natural protection. The hills also influenced farming. Terraces and carefully managed fields allowed communities to cultivate crops on sloping land. Agriculture was central to life here. People cultivated crops suited to the local climate, while also keeping animals, gathering wild resources, and using the surrounding forests. The landscape provided almost everything needed for daily life, but it also demanded careful management. Rainfall could be seasonal, and the rocky terrain made farming difficult. Water was especially important. During the rainy season, streams and pools could appear across the landscape. During the dry months, those same sources became much more limited. Communities therefore developed ways to store and manage resources. Granaries were particularly important. Traditional granaries were often raised above the ground, helping protect stored grain from moisture, rodents, and insects. Their design was practical, but also reflected local building traditions. Food storage allowed communities to survive periods when fresh crops were unavailable. The houses themselves could also be highly distinctive. Some were built with thick walls, small openings, and carefully arranged entrances. In certain settlements, buildings were grouped closely together, creating compact communities rather than scattered individual homes. The architecture was closely connected with social life. A village was more than a collection of houses. Different buildings had different functions, and spaces could be associated with families, ceremonies, food storage, or community activities. The settlement itself reflected the organization of the people who lived there. Bassari country is also important because it is not simply an abandoned archaeological site. People still live in the region today. The landscape preserves traditions that have continued across generations. Architecture, farming, crafts, and ceremonies remain connected with the communities of the region. This makes the area unusual in archaeological terms. Researchers can therefore study ancient landscapes, while also learning from living cultural traditions. The two forms of evidence are not identical, but together they provide a deeper understanding of how people have adapted to the region. The landscape is not frozen in the past. It is still being used. The Bassari, Beytik, and Fula communities have all contributed to the cultural character of the region. Their traditions developed in different environments, but their settlements share a close relationship with the landscape. Hills, forests, fields, and villages form one connected cultural system. The region also contains evidence of long-term human occupation. Rock shelters, stone features, old settlements, and agricultural landscapes reveal that people have used these mountains for generations. Some traces are obvious, others are much harder to see. A ruined wall, an old field boundary, or a forgotten pathway can preserve part of the story. Unlike the monumental ruins of Egypt or Mesopotamia, Bassari country does not depend on enormous temples or royal palaces. Its importance comes from something quieter: the relationship between people, architecture, agriculture, and landscape. It shows how communities can shape an environment without completely transforming it. The hills also provided natural materials for construction. Stone could be collected locally, earth could be shaped into walls, and vegetation supplied roofing materials. This reduced the need to transport heavy materials over long distances. The architecture was adapted to what the landscape provided. Over time, villages changed, buildings were repaired, expanded, or abandoned. New homes could appear nearby. While older structures slowly deteriorated, weather gradually wore away walls. Roofs collapsed, and vegetation returned to abandoned areas. This makes archaeological interpretation difficult. A settlement may not have disappeared because of one dramatic event. Sometimes, a village simply changes. Families move. New buildings are constructed, and older structures become unnecessary. The landscape slowly records those decisions. The region also demonstrates how difficult it can be to separate archaeology from living heritage. A ruined building may still have meaning for local communities. An old path may still be used. A traditional structure may still have a practical purpose. Preserving the past, therefore, also means protecting the people and traditions connected with it. Basari country is recognized as a remarkable cultural landscape. Its mountains, villages, fields, and traditional architecture form a connected historical environment. The ruins are not isolated monuments. They belong to a landscape that is still alive, standing among the hills. It is possible to see why communities remained here for so long. The mountains provide shelter, the valleys provide farmland, and the forests provide materials and food. Life here was never easy, but generations learned how to work with the environment. The cave village of Shavushin, high among the rocky valleys of Cappadocia. An ancient village was carved directly into the cliffs. Homes were cut into soft volcanic rock, rooms were connected by narrow passages, and entire families lived inside the walls of the mountain. This is Shavushin, one of the most remarkable cave settlements in central Turkey. Shavushin lies near the famous valleys of Cappadocia, a landscape created by volcanic eruptions millions of years ago. Ash and lava eventually hardened into soft rock, while wind and water slowly shaped it into tall cliffs, conical formations, and deep valleys. People later discovered that this rock was surprisingly easy to carve. They turned it into homes. The earliest settlement developed around natural rock formations, but over generations, people carved deeper into the cliffs. Rooms were expanded, new chambers were added, and passages connected different parts of the settlement. The result was not a normal village built beside a mountain. The mountain itself became the village. Inside the rock, people created living rooms, storage spaces, kitchens, animal areas, and places of worship. The thick stone walls helped protect the interiors from the extreme temperatures outside. During hot summers, the caves could remain relatively cool during cold winters. The rock helped retain warmth. Shavushin was also an important Christian settlement. Several churches were carved into the surrounding rock, some decorated with paintings and religious imagery. The most famous is the Church of John the Baptist, a large rock-cut church associated with the early medieval period. Its interior shows how religious architecture could be created without constructing a traditional building. The church was carved from the same soft volcanic rock as the surrounding homes. Large spaces were hollowed out, pillars were left standing, and walls were shaped to create a sacred interior. The builders had to understand the natural structure of the rock, because removing too much material could weaken the chamber. The cave churches also contain traces of painted decoration. Some frescoes depict Christian scenes, figures of saints, and religious symbols, although many paintings have suffered damage. Enough remains to show how important these spaces once were. They were not simply shelters, they were places of worship. The location of Shavushin was also significant. Cappadocia was positioned along important routes through central Anatolia. People, goods, ideas, and religions moved through the region. Christian communities established monasteries and churches among the valleys, taking advantage of the secluded landscape. The cliffs also provided natural protection. From inside the caves, people could remain hidden within the rock. Narrow entrances and high positions made some areas difficult to reach. This may have been useful during periods of conflict, although the caves were primarily homes and religious spaces. Over time, the settlement became increasingly complex. Different levels were connected by narrow paths, stairs, and carved passages. Some entrances were positioned high above the valley floor. Reaching certain rooms required climbing through the rock. The vertical nature of the village was part of everyday life. But living inside a cliff also had dangers. Rock can weaken over time, especially when chambers are expanded. Some sections eventually became unstable. Buildings cracked, passages collapsed, and parts of the old settlement were abandoned. Nature slowly reclaimed areas that people had once occupied. The caves also reveal how people adapted to limited space. Instead of spreading houses across large areas, they used the rock vertically. A single cliff could contain many rooms, one above another. This allowed a relatively large community to live within a small area. The village changed as centuries passed. Different communities occupied the caves, modified existing rooms, and created new structures. The religious landscape also changed. Churches were expanded, decorations were added, and older spaces were sometimes reused. The settlement was never completely static. Eventually, many of the cave dwellings were abandoned. People began constructing houses using more conventional materials, and some moved away from the unstable cliffside areas. The old rooms remained behind, empty inside the rock. For centuries, the caves continued to dominate the landscape. From a distance, the cliffs looked almost natural. But inside, the walls revealed evidence of human activity: doorways, windows, stairways. And chambers showed that the strange rock formations had once been homes. Modern archaeology and conservation work revealed the scale of the settlement. Researchers documented cave houses, churches, storage areas, and other carved spaces. The site became part of the wider archaeological landscape of Cappadocia, a region famous for its rock-cut architecture. Shavushan is especially interesting because the settlement was not created by one ruler. There was no single construction project. Instead, generations of ordinary people gradually shaped the cliffs. A family might enlarge one room, another might carve a new chamber, a church could be expanded, and a passage could connect separate spaces. Slowly, the mountain became a community. The surviving churches provide another glimpse into this world. Their carved interiors show that the same techniques used for homes could create surprisingly large religious spaces. Stone could become a wall, a pillar, a ceiling, or an entire sanctuary. The only material needed was the mountain itself. Shavushan stands among the valleys of Cappadocia, its abandoned caves looking across the landscape. Some rooms are damaged, others remain accessible, and the old churches preserve traces of their painted interiors. The village is no longer filled with the people who carved it, but the architecture remains. The monastery carved into the mountain, high in the mountains of Armenia. A monastery stands surrounded by steep cliffs and dramatic valleys. Part of it was built from stone, but another part disappears directly into the mountain. Rooms, chambers, and churches were carved into the rock itself. This is Geghard, one of Armenia's most remarkable medieval monasteries. Geghard is located in the Azat River Gorge, not far from Yerevan. The surrounding landscape is rugged, with tall cliffs rising around the monastery. The location was not chosen randomly. The mountains provided isolation, natural protection, and an atmosphere suited to religious life. The monastery developed over many centuries. Its origins reach back to the early Christian period in Armenia. Although much of the surviving complex dates from the medieval era, Armenia became one of the earliest kingdoms to officially adopt Christianity, and monasteries became important centers of worship, learning, and cultural life. Geghard became one of these important religious sites. The name Geghard is connected with a famous Christian relic, the Spear of Destiny, traditionally believed to be the spear used to pierce Christ. According to Armenian tradition, the relic was once kept at the monastery. This gave Geghard enormous religious importance. The monastery was also known historically as Erivank, a name meaning something like Monastery of the Cave. That name becomes clear when you enter the complex. Some of the most remarkable spaces are not ordinary stone buildings. They are carved directly into the cliffs. The builders entered the mountain, removed the rock, and created chapels and chambers inside it. The result is an unusual combination of architecture and natural stone. One of the most impressive structures is the main church, the Katagaik. It was constructed in the 13th century, during a period when the monastery was being greatly expanded. Its exterior is built from carefully cut stone, with a tall conical dome rising above the surrounding complex. But behind the main church, the rock-cut spaces become even more remarkable. Inside the monastery, stone walls and natural rock meet together. A doorway may lead from a constructed chamber, directly into a room carved from the mountain. The transition can be difficult to notice at first. Architecture seems to become geology. The rock-cut chapels are decorated with carvings, crosses, geometric patterns, and intricate stonework cover parts of the walls. One of the most distinctive Armenian designs is the khachkar, a carved stone cross surrounded by elaborate decoration. These crosses became an important part of Armenian Christian art. The khachkars at Geghard show remarkable craftsmanship. Stone was carved into complex patterns, often with interwoven forms and botanical designs. The central cross remains the focus. While the surrounding details fill the surface, no two examples are exactly alike. The monastery's natural setting also influenced its atmosphere. The gorge is narrow, the cliffs are high, and the sound of the river can be heard below. The mountains surround the complex on almost every side. For monks living here, the landscape would have created a sense of separation from ordinary life. But Geghard was not completely isolated. The monastery was connected with settlements and routes across the region. Pilgrims could travel here, especially because of its association with the sacred relic. Religious importance brought people into the remote gorge. The monastery also suffered during periods of invasion and warfare. Armenia repeatedly found itself between powerful empires, and religious centers could become targets. Geghard was attacked and damaged at different points in its history, yet the complex continued to survive. The surrounding cliffs may have helped to protect parts of the monastery. The rock-cut chambers were physically integrated into the mountain. They could not simply be demolished like a freestanding wooden structure. Even when buildings were damaged, the carved spaces remained part of the cliff. One of the most fascinating questions concerns the earliest stages of the site. Traditions describe an ancient monastery existing here long before the medieval buildings we see today, but much of the surviving architecture belongs to later periods. The site therefore contains a mixture of history, tradition, and physical evidence. The medieval expansion was especially important. Powerful Armenian rulers and nobles supported the monastery, providing resources for construction. The complex grew into a major religious center. Churches, chapels, tombs, and other structures were added. The architecture also reveals the skill of Armenian builders. The main church uses carefully fitted stone blocks, while the dome rises above a square interior. The transition between the square walls and circular dome required careful engineering. The builders achieved this without modern machinery, inside the rock-cut chambers. The challenge was different. Instead of assembling stone, the workers had to remove it. They needed to understand the structure of the mountain. Leaving enough rock to support the spaces above, a mistake could permanently damage the chamber. This combination makes Geghard especially unusual. One part of the monastery appears to have been constructed. Another appears to have been discovered inside the mountain. But both were created by human hands. The natural cliff became part of the sacred architecture. Over the centuries, the monastery continued to function as a religious center. Monks lived here, visitors came to worship, and manuscripts and religious traditions were preserved. The complex remained important even as political powers around Armenia changed. Eventually, the religious community became smaller. Modern political changes transformed Armenia, and monastic life was disrupted. But Geghard survived as a monument, and later became an important cultural heritage site. Today, the monastery remains surrounded by the dramatic Azat Gorge. The stone church stands beneath the cliffs, while the carved chambers disappear into the mountain. Khatkars cover parts of the complex, and centuries-old carvings remain visible on the walls. The fortress city of Golconda, on a rocky hill outside Hyderabad. A massive fortress rises above the surrounding landscape. Thick walls follow the shape of the hill. Huge gateways guard the entrances, and deep inside, palaces, mosques, reservoirs, courtyards, and ruins remain scattered across the stone. This is Golconda Fort, one of the most important fortified cities of medieval India. Golconda's history stretches back many centuries. The earliest fortifications on the hill were much simpler, but the site became far more important under the Qutbi Shahi rulers. From the 16th century onward, Golconda developed into the center of a powerful kingdom. The fort was expanded, walls were strengthened, and the settlement around it grew. The location was carefully chosen. The fort stands on a large granite hill, with steep natural slopes providing an additional defensive advantage. The builders did not have to create a completely artificial fortress. They used the landscape itself. Walls followed the contours of the rock, making the fort difficult to approach. Golconda eventually developed into a huge fortified complex. Its outer defensive walls stretched for several kilometers with massive gateways, towers, bastions, and fortified entrances. The walls were designed to withstand attacks, while also controlling movement into the city. Inside the fort, the landscape becomes surprisingly complex. There were royal buildings, mosques, audience halls, storage areas, gardens, water systems, and residential spaces. Golconda was not simply a military outpost. It was a functioning royal city. People lived and worked within its walls, while the ruling court controlled the surrounding kingdom. One of the most famous features is the acoustic system at the main entrance. At the Fateh Darwaza, a sharp clap made beneath the gateway can reportedly be heard much farther inside the fort. The effect comes from the shape and arrangement of the stone and vaulted surfaces. Sound travels through the structure, allowing a signal at the entrance to be heard at a higher point. This would have been useful in a fortified settlement. A warning could travel through the complex, without someone needing to run across the entire fort. The exact historical use of the system is difficult to establish. But the acoustic effect itself remains impressive. Water was another major challenge. A large fortified city could not survive without a dependable supply. Golconda's builders developed systems to collect, store, and move water around the hill. Reservoirs, channels, wells, and other hydraulic features were incorporated into the complex. The fort's elevated position made this particularly difficult. Water had to be brought to different levels, sometimes using mechanical lifting systems. Persian wheels and other technologies were used in the wider region, helping raise water for gardens, buildings, and royal spaces. The engineering becomes even more impressive when we consider the size of the settlement. Large numbers of people could occupy the fort and its surrounding city. They needed drinking water, food, storage, and sanitation. A fortress this large had to function as a complete urban system. Golconda was also famous for something far beyond its walls. The surrounding region became one of the world's great diamond-producing areas. Diamonds from the Deccan became internationally famous, and Golconda became closely associated with some of the most valuable stones known at the time. The name Golconda eventually became almost synonymous with legendary wealth. Famous diamonds such as the Koh-i-Noor, the Hope Diamond, and others have been historically associated with the broader Golconda diamond trade. But the diamonds were not necessarily mined directly inside the fort. The surrounding Deccan region was the important source. Golconda served as a major center for their trade. This wealth strengthened the Qutbi Shahi kingdom. The rulers could invest in architecture, military defenses, religious buildings, and elaborate royal spaces. The fort therefore became both a military stronghold and a symbol of political power. The Qutbi Shahi rulers also developed Hyderabad nearby, eventually establishing a new capital south of Golconda. Charminar became the center of that new city, but Golconda remained an important fortress. The two cities became closely connected. Inside Golconda, royal architecture reveals the lifestyle of the ruling elite. Audience halls provided spaces where rulers could meet officials, receive visitors, and conduct political affairs. Palaces were designed around courtyards, while elevated structures provided views across the surrounding region. The fort also contains several mosques and religious buildings. Their architecture reflects the Islamic traditions of the Qutbi Shahi period, while also incorporating local Deccan craftsmanship. Stone, stucco, arches, domes, and decorative details appear throughout the complex. The walls themselves are among the most impressive remains. Huge granite blocks were used in sections of the fortifications, and the defensive system incorporated natural rock formations. Some bastions were positioned on elevated points, giving defenders broad views across the approaches. A fortress like this depended on more than thick walls. Defenders needed food, water, weapons, storage, and communication. Golconda was designed as a self-contained stronghold, capable of resisting attack for extended periods. That defensive strength was eventually tested. In the late 17th century, the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb expanded southward, bringing the Qutbi Shahi kingdom into direct conflict with the Mughal Empire. Golconda resisted for a time, but the fortress eventually fell in 1687. The siege lasted for months, and the fort's defenses proved difficult to overcome. Eventually, Mughal forces entered the fortress. The Qutbi Shahi dynasty came to an end, and Golconda lost its position as the center of an independent kingdom. After the conquest, the fort's political importance declined. Some buildings continued to be used, but the great royal city gradually lost its former role. Over time, roofs collapsed, walls weathered, and vegetation began spreading through abandoned areas. Yet much of Golconda survived. The massive granite walls remained. The gateways still stood, and the outline of the ancient city remained visible across the hill. The fort became a monument to a kingdom that had disappeared. Today, visitors can climb through the enormous gateways, walk along the old walls, and explore the ruined palace areas. From the higher sections, Hyderabad spreads across the horizon. The modern city has grown around a fortress that once stood almost alone. Golconda is especially fascinating because its history is not contained within one building. The entire hill was transformed. Defensive walls, royal residences, religious buildings, water systems, and roads were woven together into one enormous fortified landscape.